right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's virtual field trip. So my name's GOB, and you are about to watch the Geo Show. If this is your first experience on Alert Around the World virtual field trip, this is an interactive experience. You can interact with the show one of many ways. So one way is to send in your text questions. This applies to everyone on and off of camera today. This is interactive for you. Send in your text questions early and often to either the Q&A app built right into your Zoom window that you see me in right now, or you can use Twitter. So if you're a Twitter user, just use the hashtag GEOshow, and you will be able to send me questions over on Twitter as well. Now, I only follow the hashtag GEOshow, so if you know my handle, I will not look at that, just only the hashtag, so make sure you're using it. Today's game pin for Kahoot is 854-5739. We do use Kahoot, so if you've never used it before, go to kahoot.it on any web browser. Use that game pin to get logged in. It's located in your chat box as well. Select your nickname, and you'll be in the running for a postcard at the end of the show if you win our Geo quiz. All right, we also use Flipgrid here on the Geo Show, so if you stump me on any questions, I'll research the correct answers for those that I need to do more research on. Post those up at flipgrid.com/GeoShow, so check that out later on today. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It is that time. Explorers, are you ready? All right, let's do it, guys. All right. Welcome, all explorers. You're now watching the Geo Show USA edition. And the title of today's show is The Brooklyn Bridge, brought to you by Learn Around the World, bringing you guest speakers and virtual field trips just like this from all around the planet. We're kicking off today's show with our first survey question using Kahoot. So if you're not logged in, make sure you go to Kahoot.it. Enter in the game pin today, which is 854-5739. You'll be linked right up. Just a couple reminders, if this is your first experience on the Geo Show or it's been a while, we only give you 10 seconds to answer your question, so not a lot of time. That's why we're going to do some practice survey questions. These aren't worth points. If you're not logged in yet, that's okay. Make sure you look up at the screen because this is where you see the questions and the answers, not down on your devices. All right, so we're going to go ahead and launch that first survey question. Again, if you're not logged in yet, don't worry. You'll have the opportunity to do so. All right. Here we go, guys. So where is the Brooklyn Bridge? We're going to virtually walk across the bridge today, but where is it? Is it located in red, Chicago, blue, San Francisco, yellow, Miami, or green, New York City? And if you said green, New York City, you are correct. All right, so virtual high fives going out to everyone that selected green. All right, so we are going to New York City today. But where is New York City? If you've never been to New York City, let's talk about where that's located, because Geo Show is a geography-based show. That means location matters, explorers. So normally we go around the world on the Geo Show, but on the USA edition, we're staying right inside of the United States of America, and we're going to the East Coast. So New York City is located in the state of New York. New York is located on the East Coast. So as we go ahead and zoom into our location today, I'm going to go ahead and, for those of you that don't know where it's at, let's just freeze right here for just 1 second. I just want to highlight right up here. So this red shaded area, this is the state of New York. It's quite a big state, actually, but most people, if you're not from there, we just think of New York City, right? So New York City is actually down at the mouth of the Hudson River in southern New York, so way down here. And New York actually includes this long island as well, and it's called Long Island. You may have heard of Long Island before as well. So as we zoom in a little bit closer, so New York is located on the mouth of the Hudson River. So that's right about here. So this way is Long Island, going out that way that I was just talking about. We do have New Jersey across the Hudson River. So this area over here, that to give you an idea of where we're talking about today. When we look at just the city, so just New York City here, New York City is made up of 5 boroughs. New York City is made up of how many boroughs, explorers? 5. Five. So a borough was kind of like it's kind of like a small city within a city, basically. So each one of these five boroughs, they have their own governments, they have their own politicians, but they all operate with under the umbrella of New York City. So what are these five boroughs? So we have the Bronx. If we have any Yankees fans out there, that's where the Yankee Stadium is located. We have Queens in green. We have Brooklyn in red that we're going to talk a lot about today. We have Staten Island over to the left in blue, and we have Manhattan. Now, originally, each one of these boroughs were their own cities. So at the time the Brooklyn Bridge was built, we'll talk about that time period, Manhattan was called New York City. So it's Manhattan Island. Today it's called Manhattan, the borough of Manhattan. But at the time that the bridge was built, this was New York City, and Brooklyn was its own city. They were two separate cities, but today they're all under the umbrella of New York City. Okay, so when we go down a little bit closer, let's look at the bottom of Manhattan right here. And so why? Why are bridges important? So if we look at the geography of New York City, and specifically Manhattan here, this is an island. So all this yellow shaded area that you see, this is an island, and it is separated from land by the Hudson River to our left and the East River to our right. Now we're going to focus on the East River today, but the Hudson is Manhattan bridges and tunnels and other ways of crossing these rivers are very important to the city today, and boat traffic as well. So over here is New Jersey off to our left again, but we are focusing on the East River today, which separates Manhattan in yellow and Brooklyn that we see in red. And right here is the Brooklyn Bridge. So the Brooklyn Bridge was the first bridge that was constructed connecting the boroughs or New Jersey and New York. But at the time, there were no other bridges. So Brooklyn Bridge was the first one, and so it was extremely important when they connected these two boroughs. So when we look at the Brooklyn Bridge, we'll go ahead and look at it from our satellite here. So this one right here is the Brooklyn Bridge. This is the Manhattan Bridge, but we are focusing on the Brooklyn Bridge today. It's definitely by far the most famous of the bridges in New York City. We'll talk about why that might be. Let's talk about the size of this bridge. It is pretty massive. At the time when it was constructed, it was the largest bridge in the world. It's not any longer, but it was for a time period. It's in total from one end to the other is 5,989 feet long. That includes the bridge that's over the land and water. However, if we just look at the section that's just over the East River, the water, that is 1,595.5 feet going across the East River. A couple other dimensions of the bridge just to talk about is 85 feet wide, and the clearance under the bridge, so that means the measurement from the bottom of the bridge to the top of the water there is 135 feet. Okay, so that means if you are on a boat that is below 135 feet tall, then you can pass easily under the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, and as we spin around, we're going to show Lower Manhattan here, and just want to point out, look at all those skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan. So we're going to talk a lot about that today, and partly because I want to also tell you how tall these towers are. So there's two towers on the Brooklyn Bridge, and they are 276.5 feet tall. Now, why is that important? Well, because when the Brooklyn Bridge was first opened, so it took 14 years to build. It was finished in 1883. So this is the end of the 1800s. So we need to keep a couple of things in mind here. This 276.5 feet tall. At the time when this was over, not inches, feet. So at the time when the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed, so in 1883, these were the tallest structures in all of North America and in New York City, obviously. All the buildings at the time when the Brooklyn Bridge was open, there was no building that was over. They were like steeples of churches and stuff that were higher, but there were no buildings that were taller than 6 stories high. So that would have been way down here. So when that means when you walked over the bridge, you were looking down on the city. You were looking out over Manhattan into, which was New York at the time, into New Jersey. You could look all across Brooklyn. Today, you can't do that because New York City is a very tall city, as we'll see today. And the last thing I want to tell you about the importance of the Brooklyn Bridge. When this bridge was opened, again, this was the largest bridge in the world. It was a massive event. And here we see an illustration from a local newspaper from the festivities. There were 14,000 tons of fireworks that were shot off for over an hour straight on the day that they opened. So it was May 24th, 1883. The bridge opened at 2 o'clock that day, but at night they had a massive celebration. I've seen an interview with someone that was alive during the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge and when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And they say that the Brooklyn Bridge was a way bigger event for their lives and for them and the people that they knew than Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. I mean, that tells you how important this opening was of this bridge. And which brings us to our first submitted question via Flipgrid.
Hi, my name is David Lute, and I live in Lee Grande, California, and I have a question for you. Why is the Brooklyn Bridge so important?
All right, that's a great question. So when we talk about importance of bridges, it's become very famous. It's one of the most famous landmarks, not only in New York, but also in the country. And but why? So why is it? A couple of things I'll point out when we start going down and looking at the Brooklyn Bridge that I think it's a nice blend of old and new. What I mean by that, you'll see lots of beautiful stonework, but there's also steel that was used to construct the Brooklyn Bridge. So it was the combination of old building materials and new modern building materials. It stood the test of time. And then over the years, it's inspired music. Frank Sinatra, famous songs about the Brooklyn Bridge, movies. It's been in famous paintings. Georgia O'Keeffe has made beautiful paintings of the Brooklyn Bridge. And even local artists to this day, which we'll see on our virtual walkover, you'll see them selling their artwork of the Brooklyn Bridge. So it's just become a very iconic symbol of New York City and the modern world, just building with steel, building structures with steel. It was one of the first massive structures that used steel. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to introduce our guest classrooms and go down and walk over the bridge. So first up, we have Mrs. Escobar's third graders from La Grande, California. Welcome to the show, guys. Hi. All right, do we have any fun facts about the Brooklyn Bridge from your class today? Go for it.
Hi, my name is Ethan, and did you know that dynamite was actually used for the first time in construction
in the bridge?
Uh-huh.
Cool. I didn't even know that. So or if I have, I definitely forgot it by now. So a great fun fact. So dynamite was being used. Awesome. And next up, we have Mrs. Tabola's fifth graders from Utica, Michigan. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hi. Hello.
All right. And do you guys have any fun facts you would like to share from your research about the Brooklyn Bridge?
Did you know that the movies Enchanted and Transformers both had the Brooklyn Bridge in them?
Right. So lots of movies, as we've talked about it. The Transformers, I forget, was one of the Spider-Mans, like he was strung out on the Brooklyn? I don't know. But it's been in a ton of movies, even publicity stunts. There's right after it opened, there were people that were jumping off the bridge, which was extremely dangerous. People have died doing this. People have tried to do stunts off the bridge. It's been used in a lot of things over the years. It's just been a very famous spot and for making artwork like movies. Great fun fact there. Next up, we have Mrs. Guerrero's third graders from La Grande, California as well. Welcome to the show, guys. All right, look at it. They're ready for St. Patty's Day. And do you guys have a fun fact you would like to share? Go for it.
Did you know that P.T. Barnum took 21 elephants over the bridge to show that it was safe?
Right. I love this fun fact. So as we're going to learn today, so people were scared. Okay, guys, this was the largest bridge in the world at the time. And people in New York and Brooklyn had never been this high up before. And so they were people were scared, and that's because many of the bridges in the 1800s, many of this type of bridge, which we're going to learn about, many of these bridges during the 1800s collapsed. And it wasn't until they started using steel cabling and steel in the construction of these bridges that they became more sturdy and safe. And because of that, people were very scared, and they wouldn't even cross the bridge. So as a publicity stunt, they marched elephants across to prove how strong it was. Now, just to give you an idea how scared people were, one of the first major accidents that was not to do with the construction, but only 6 days after opening on May 30th, there was a big stampede. That means people were out on the bridge, and someone started a rumor that the bridge was falling. People panicked, and they stampeded down the stairways at the anchorages. That'll make sense in a minute what those are. And 12 people died. They got crushed. So, I mean, it proves to you, like, even if you like to make jokes sometimes, it's not always a good time to make a joke, especially in a situation when people are frightened. And today we think that's silly, right? We go up in high buildings all the time. But in the late 1800s, this was not normal to be up over 135 feet on a structure over the middle of the East River. This was very new to these people. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Since we're talking about bridges, we got lots of classrooms watching from the outside as well. We'll give some shout outs as we go along. Before we go down and walk over the bridge, I do want to introduce really quickly the parts of a suspension bridge. Okay, so the type of bridge the Brooklyn Bridge is a suspension bridge. And we're going to talk about some of the basic parts. So the first off, you need a tower. It doesn't have to be two. The Brooklyn Bridge has 2 towers. It can be 1 tower, or it could be 5 towers. It doesn't really matter the number of towers. It depends on how long your bridge is going to be. The towers typically sit on a pier. And we'll talk about what's made this unique at the time. For the very first time, they were building or constructing towers at the bottom of deep water in the East River. And because of that, they had to use a special device called a caisson. We'll introduce that in just a few minutes. But so the main cables, so there's 4 main cables on the Brooklyn Bridge. This can vary between bridges and their designs. The Brooklyn Bridge has 4 main cables that are strung all the way across the bridge and anchored into the anchorages. All right, that's a weird word. Can everyone say anchorage? Anchorage. All right. And so if you notice, that root word in anchorage is anchor. So just like an anchor holds a boat in place, these anchorages, they have anchor plates in them that hold the main cables in place. And this is what holds all of the weight that is going across the Brooklyn Bridge and the bridge itself. All right. So these are very important to the design of a suspension bridge. Okay, next you have the deck. So the deck is the roadway, walkway, whatever you want to call it, that the people, cars, horse and buggies, subway trains, whatever's passing over the bridge goes over the deck. And the deck is being held by suspension cables. So the deck is suspended from the main cables, and that's where this type of bridge gets its name from. And those are the basic parts of a suspension bridge. So we are going to start our bridge tour. We're going to go down on the ground. We're on the streets in Brooklyn, and we are about to take a walk over 5,000 feet across the Brooklyn Bridge. All right, I just wanted to turn around real quick and give you guys a look of what daytime looks like in Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn is a massive city. It's just this area right at the end of Brooklyn Bridge is not going to be as busy as what we'll see in Manhattan. If Brooklyn was its own separate city still today, it would still be one of the largest cities in the U.S., but it is part of New York City. So as we turn around, we're going to start walking over the bridge. As we do so, I just want to point out, when you go here, and I hope you all get to one day, then you always want to stay in the proper lane. So we have a pedestrian lane and we have a bicycle lane on the section that we are going to cross over, because we're going to do a walk across today. You can drive a car across, or you can ride a subway across. All right, so we are walking and we're going to skip through some of these long sections. That's the beauty of a virtual tour. And right away, we start to see those massive towers. So we see the Brooklyn Tower on the Brooklyn side, and behind it is the Manhattan Tower. And already we can see, look, the city is much taller today than these towers are. But when it was built, you have to envision everything else being a lot lower than what it is today. As we get closer, we'll stop and kind of look over the side here, and you'll notice that there's lots of car traffic that takes advantage of this bridge. In fact, about 124,000 vehicles cross the Brooklyn Bridge every single day. We have 3 lanes coming out of Manhattan into Brooklyn, and right on the other side of the boardwalk there, we have 3 lanes going from Brooklyn into Manhattan. Up on our high boardwalk here, again, we have a pedestrian lane. About 10,000 people walk across the Brooklyn Bridge on average every day. And over here in the bike lane, on average, about 3,500 bicyclists cross the Brooklyn Bridge every single day. All right, so it's getting a lot of use. What's really unique about the Brooklyn Bridge is, unlike many of the bridges found in New York, there are no tolls on the Brooklyn Bridge. So you don't have to pay a toll today. When it first opened, you had to pay a toll, but not today. So you can see already we have, you see our bicyclists going by. Lots of steel. So you see the steel on each side over the roadway, and the cables are all steel as well. You see we have 4 main cables. Remember, each of these main cables are anchored right below our feet in the anchorage. They run over the tower, down in the middle, over Manhattan side, and then they're anchored over across the river in Manhattan in that anchorage. So if we look off over to the right, we can see that main cable, how it starts off really low right here. And just to give you something to follow with your eye to help you guys out, because they have everything painted the same colors. It's kind of hard to see some of this stuff. So that you see that main cable behind there, behind some of that steel that's coming out of the anchorage, and we can follow it with our eye all the way up to the Brooklyn Tower, the Brooklyn side tower. All right, so the other cables that we see here, we remember that the suspension cables are the ones that are hanging straight down. So these are the ones that are holding up the deck that we're walking on. And then there's a, this was new at the time, but you see these diagonal cables. These diagonal cables are stabilizing cables. So they keep the bridge from swaying back and forth. Remember, I said many of the bridges were unsafe, unsturdy in the 1800s and collapsed. These stabilizing cables really helped. You can barely feel anything. It doesn't. I've never experienced a sway when I've been on here. Maybe it does in really, really high winds. But for the most part, they work really, really well. And they provide just a beautiful aesthetic. It really looks like a spider web. Like the closer you get to the towers, it's really cool. And you see that displayed in a lot of the artwork when you find people that have painted these. Again, one of the reasons I believe that it stood the test of time as far as popularity is look at the beautiful, the Gothic style of stonework that is the towers are built out of. And then when you combine that with the steel, it's a blending of the old era and the modern era of building. And so it's really a beautiful bridge in my personal opinion. Now, if we compare it, you look over here, this is the Manhattan Bridge right next to the Brooklyn Bridge. This one is all steel. So, I mean, nothing's wrong. It just looks like a typical bridge. But in my opinion, it's not near as beautiful as the Brooklyn Bridge because the Brooklyn Bridge has that beautiful the stone towers. And if we look out towards Midtown in Manhattan, there's one landmark, another famous landmark that we can see in New York. So the Empire State Building. The Brooklyn Bridge is really cool to cross over at nighttime because you see the city lit up. And the Empire State Building is always, they have different color combinations that they'll use for different holidays. Guarantee, I would bet all the money I have that tomorrow it's going to be lit up green for St. Patty's Day. So that would be fun to see. And when we look off to our left into downtown Manhattan, you can see how tall those buildings are. So we're going to leave. We're walking from the Brooklyn Tower now to the center of the bridge. Now, remember, these main cables droop down at a low point right at the center. So we're going to go out there and see why it's such a great place to come visit, the middle of the bridge. So these are the suspension cables, and you can see I can fit my whole hand around them. And right here, so this is we want to point this out, is you see these cables, how they're twisted together. So the way cables are constructed, there are lots of smaller wires that are combined to make a larger cable. And sometimes they're straight, as we'll see in our main cable. But these suspension cables, they had a technique called roebling. Now, as we're going to learn a little bit later in the show, the man that designed the Brooklyn Bridge was named John Roebling. And he had his own cable company. In fact, he was one of the first people that started using steel and starting different techniques with steel. And he's the one that came up with this technique. And the technique was to twist all of the steel wires. And when you twisted them, it makes it stronger. So this smaller cable has the same strength as one that is larger than it, simply because it has its cables, or the wires are twisted. You can see them twisted going up and down there. And again, that technique is called roebling. So those are roebling cables. All right, so we'll continue our walk to the center of the bridge. As I said before, the cool thing about the center of the bridge, as you see how these main cables, they droop down below the upper deck where we're walking on. So that means no suspension cables will be in our line of sight. So you get you get fantastic views without any cables in your way of lower Manhattan and Brooklyn and Midtown. And off the points of lower Manhattan, out here, we get to see another famous landmark, which is the Statue of Liberty, another great place to, something else it's awesome to go see in New York. And again, lots of islands, lots of waterways. Liberty Island, you have to take a ferry to get out there. You can't just walk to it. All right. And so we go back real quick. So we just saw the Statue of Liberty, and walking from the center of the bridge, I'm going to turn up the volume a little bit so you can hear some of the sounds and with the sights of crossing the bridge. Of points of interest here. One is this is the Manhattan Tower. The Manhattan Tower is actually not sitting on bedrock. We'll talk about why that is when we talk about the construction. But I want you to notice how many more people are on the Manhattan side. Look at this. Look at all these people. Why is that? Well, most of these people are tourists, and they're walking out to the center of the bridge to take their pictures, and then they turn around and walk back into Manhattan. So that's why this side of the bridge gets so much more traffic. Remember earlier I showed you guys we had a bike lane, which is right there, and over here is the pedestrian lane. So if you guys want to go to New York and get yelled at, I don't know why anyone would want to be yelled at, but let's just say that you want to be yelled at. Go to New York City and stand in the bike lane on the Brooklyn Bridge. Guaranteed you're going to get yelled at. So this, I like, the only reason I bring this up is when we travel to other places around the world and even in our own country, we are a visitor explorers. We are there, we're visiting, and we want to learn about these awesome places, but we also need to be mindful of people that live there. They're going about their day-to-day lives. They're on the way to work, or they're on the way to school. Maybe they're running late. And, the worst thing in the world is if you're late for school and you're riding your bicycle and people are taking selfies in the bike lane. And we want to share this space with everyone, the tourists and locals. So always be mindful when you're visiting. Also, why is this bridge important? Not only for people to get across it, but it's become such an iconic part of New York City. So many people come here, as we've seen all the tourists, but here's an actual tour group. This is a local tour guide that makes money by taking people around and telling them and teaching them about the bridge. Again, we've talked several times about artists. and this bridge has inspired artists over the years with their artwork, and they can come here and sell their artwork as well to tourists. So it's a way that people can generate income as well. So again, we see some commuters that are getting slowed up by the foot traffic. And you always want to park your bikes out of the way as well. Now, the cool thing about the towers, when you go here one day, and all of you will, right? So you can learn, if you forget anything I tell you today, you can learn a little bit of extra information about the Brooklyn Bridge. They have some plaques with the part of the construction that are on there, just to, to explain it and teach you how the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed. Now, as we're leaving the Manhattan Tower, we're entering Manhattan, and we'll turn up the sounds there. As we pass a school group, they're actually doing a physical field trip here. Right, and I just want to point out here, guys, remember at the time the Brooklyn Bridge was open, right around here somewhere, the entire city was below 6 stories high. So everything that we see above that green line would not have been here in 1880. All right, so our bicyclists are going to go to the right. We're going to go to the left here. Here's a stairway that you can get to one of the subway stops if you so chose to. Again, we have more people selling souvenirs, small trinkets, things to take home, give to their children or their brothers or sisters when they visit New York City and go home. There's artwork, again, beautiful photographs, drawings, illustrations, paintings of the Brooklyn Bridge as well that you can get right here. There's also food that you can get. If you're hungry, you need a snack, you need some hydration, you can get all of that stuff right at the end, especially on the Manhattan side. We didn't see any of this stuff on the Brooklyn side because most of the people that are crossing the Brooklyn Bridge from the Brooklyn side are locals. They're not going out to the bridge to buy these things, but tourists are. And just to point out a couple of cultural points of interest in New York City, we'll cross the street just to point out a couple of things where this bridge ends in the middle of Manhattan. So one, if you're from a small town like I am, guys, I grew up in a very small town in North Carolina, there were no crosswalk lights or crosswalks for that matter. And so you need to be mindful, be very careful when you cross any street, look both ways, but especially in a city, they do have very special stoplights for pedestrians. So you should wait always till it says go before you cross. It's also illegal, so you can actually get a ticket as well if you do it. Here, if you see all these cones, not only can you, as a tourist, you can come and purchase souvenirs to take home, but you can purchase entertainment. So these are street performers, another thing that's popular to do, a popular activity in New York City, especially in Central Park and famous areas like City Hall Park, which what we're at now. I've seen these guys, they'll take 6 people and run and stand up and do a flip over all these people standing up back to back. It's pretty amazing that they do that. And right here, if you ever in New York City, these green and white bulbs, if you ever see these by these green guardrails, these are subway entrances and exits. So if you're looking for a subway, the first time I visited New York City, I did not know to look up for those. So it was kind of hard to find the subway stop sometime. Now they're easy, and now they're easy to find for you guys too. And last thing I'll point out is see lots of street food here. New York is a famous place because it's so diverse. You can get food from all over the world in restaurants and on the street here. And right behind, as we see how many more people are coming and going off the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side, and right behind us is City Hall. And we'll just fast walk through City Hall Park for you guys. because I just want to show you guys City Hall. Now, the Brooklyn Bridge is off to our right now that we're in City Hall Park. So the Brooklyn Bridge is that way. But I just wanted to point out, because I think this is a cool fun fact, is that the entire front side of City Hall is made with expensive stonework, like marble. The back was made with cheap stone. And the thinking at the time was, hey, we can save a lot of money because the entire city is below us, meaning it's going back this way, right? So at the time, behind City Hall, which is most of New York City now, most of Manhattan, when we think of Central Park, Times Square, Empire State Building, Harlem, all these other places, at the time City Hall was built, that was just kind of the pasture area. There was not much of a city back there. And it goes to show you how much the city has blown up and expanded over the years. All right. And that is our virtual tour over the Brooklyn Bridge. We're going to open up the floor for some questions here. So go ahead, if you're on camera with us, get your kids sent up to the camera to ask your questions. If you're watching from off of camera today, you might want to go ahead and make sure you get those questions sent in to #GeoShow, or you want to utilize that Q&A app that's built right into your Zoom window right below my head that you see me here. So we have one here. Mr. Wheat's classroom wants to know how many workers were involved in the building of the bridge, and were there sadly any casualties? Yes, there were casualties on the Brooklyn Bridge. The numbers I have found, is hard to find a great primary source as far as the records that they kept at the time, but 20 to 30 workers died during this time, but many more became injured. And even one of the main engineers, we'll talk about what that is. It was a disease that was first really became a problem during the building of this bridge. And as far as the number of workers, around 600 or so workers. And because I know we're going to get this question, since we're talking about workers, how much did they make? The masons, the ones that were working on the stone towers, got paid the most money. They got paid 30 cents an hour. Just a typical day laborer, so carrying heavy things back and forth, 2.5 cents an hour. Riggers, people that were rigging the cable systems, they got paid 15 cents an hour. And if you were one of the sand hogs, so these were the people that were working under the river, digging in mud and muck. I'll tell you about those guys in a minute. That was the most dangerous job. They got paid $2 a day. And I found an interview with a guy that was 10 years old at the time, and he was a water boy giving water out to everyone. He got paid $1.10 a day handing out water to all of the workers. There you go. All right, so let's start off. Let's go over to Mrs. Guerrero's classroom in LeGrand first this time. Do you have a question for us? All right, I'm not getting your audio. We'll come right back to you in just a minute. And let's go over to Michigan. Do you guys have a question for us?
Yes. Yes. Do you know what the first thing to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge was?
I don't know I can tell you the first passage across the Brooklyn Bridge, but it was not on foot. The first official crossing of the Brooklyn Bridge was done by Emily Roebling, and she was extremely important. So we're going to learn about the people that built the bridge. So John Roebling designed it. Unfortunately, he died, and his son took over the construction of the bridge, but his son got very sick with that sickness that we're going to talk about. It's called Caisson's disease for them. Today it's known as the bends. I'll explain what that means in just a minute. But he couldn't go out and work for day to day. He got very ill. He could barely walk. He was like paralyzed. He could only sit in his apartment in Brooklyn and look out in the window. But his wife, Emily, she was the one that oversaw the day-to-day operations for most of the building of the bridge. So she doesn't, you don't find her name a lot, but she deserves a lot, if not just as equal amount of credit for the Brooklyn Bridge getting built. And she crossed the bridge on a cart carrying a rooster. And the reason she carried a rooster is because it was a symbol of victory. And that's why they took a rooster across. Great question there. Let's go over to Mrs. Escobar's classroom. Do you guys have a question for us? Okay, go for it.
You know what? Can you come right back to us?
All right. And let's see if our audio is working over in our other LeGrand classroom. Go for it. Yeah, I'm not getting it for whatever reason. We had you earlier, so we'll see if we keep working on it. And coming in, we have Mr. Gillian's classroom, and shout out to you guys. And they want to know, how do they get electricity to the lights on the bridge, and how do they change the lights? Okay, so electricity is there are wires that are going out to the lights on the bridge today. I don't know about early days as far as lights when it was first open. I'll see what I can find after the show and post it the Flipgrid. But I do know during the time period before 1883, what else was going on during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge? Well, we have the invention of the light bulb and the telephone, and also water, indoor plumbing was put into the White House during this time as well. Any baseball fans out there? The curveball was invented and introduced into baseball. So cool facts there. And looks like we got our question ready over Mrs. Escobar's class, so go for it.
Did Emily have any knowledge about bridges or schooling?
My understanding is no. So they did not have any, or she did not have any engineering background. And I'll have to double check on Emily's background, but Washington was doing most of the engineering work, the planning from there. And she was facilitating, she was managing the project. So if you ever heard of project managers that are entire careers today, it's a very important part of doing something big. You have lots of people that are working on this big, massive project. Someone has to manage that. Someone has to make sure all the teams. You guys ever do projects in class where you have multiple groups, or if you've done any mystery Skypes where you have people that are running around facilitating everything? These are important jobs. These are important tasks, and that's what Emily was doing. And we'll see if our audio is working over Mrs. Guerrero's class. Go for it. Yeah, I'm still not getting you, but I have, they did type in, how much did it cost to build the bridge, coming from Angel? Great question, Angel. So at the time, in the money in 1883, they spent $15,500,000, so $15.5 million. What is that in today's money? In today's money, that's somewhere around $385 million if we wanted to build the Brooklyn Bridge today. And it was split up. So New York, or Manhattan, right? It was New York at the time. They paid 33 and a third cents on every dollar spent, and Brooklyn spent 66 and 2/3 cents on every dollar spent. So Brooklyn funded most of the bridge, 2/3 of the bridge. All right, great questions there. Let's talk about the construction of it. I know we're getting, we have lots of questions about how things are put together and built, and who these people were. And when we look at it, first of all, like, remember we talked about why, we're trying to cross this water. Well, at the time they had ferries. So ferries were going across, boat traffic. That was responsible for taking everyone back and forth before these bridges were built. Well, in the late 1800s, there were a couple really cold winters that froze over the East River. That stopped, put a halt to all of the boat traffic. Now, some people were able to, I've seen or heard old tales of people actually walking across the East River during the icy weather, but you couldn't continue commerce. Okay, you couldn't continue business between New York City and Brooklyn at the time when the river was frozen over. So that really inspired them, or really like kind of sped up the process to say, hey, we need to put a bridge across the East River. So that's why they wanted to do it in the first place. And at the time, John Roebling had successfully built suspension bridges using steel at Niagara Falls and Cincinnati before the Brooklyn Bridge. So they were fairly confident that he could do this to begin with. Which brings us to our next pre-submitted question today.
Why was the Brooklyn Bridge called the Brooklyn Bridge?
All right, so why was it? Before I answer that, let's do another survey question. So if you're playing along on Kahoot, go ahead and grab your devices, and we're going to launch in 3, 2, 1. Over its history, the bridge has been called Blue the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, yellow, the Brooklyn Bridge, green, the East River Bridge, or red, all of these? All right, so over its history, the Brooklyn Bridge has actually been called by all of these names. So the question was, why is it called the Brooklyn Bridge? Well, initially it was referred to as the East River Bridge and the New York and Brooklyn Bridge. The name, they kept going back and forth with the name. Eventually they settled on the New York and Brooklyn Bridge. Can you imagine having to say that long name every single time you reference the bridge? Hey, I crossed the New York City and Brooklyn Bridge today. It's just too long. It naturally became shortened. People just started referring to it as the Brooklyn Bridge instead of the New York City and Brooklyn Bridge. It was just too long. So it was more of something that just happened organically. And then today, everyone just calls it the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's known as the Brooklyn Bridge today. But great question there. When we also look at earlier, we talked about John Roebling a couple times, and John Roebling is the man that designed the Brooklyn Bridge. He was the engineer. He was the man that owned the cable company, well, one of the cable companies that they use for the bridge. And unfortunately, John Roebling never saw the Brooklyn Bridge being built. He died before construction began. He got his foot caught. Remember, he talked about ferry boats? Well, they were looking for a place to build the Brooklyn Tower. His foot got crushed in between two boards. He got something called tetanus. And so if anyone has ever got cut before, stepped on a nail, or had any kind of rusty metal that cut themselves before, you go to the hospital, right? We get a tetanus shot. Shots aren't fun, but vaccines are good. And the tetanus shot is, if it was around then, John Roebling would have been around to see the Brooklyn Bridge when it was finished, but he was not. He died before it was finished. And because of that, his son, Washington Roebling, took over the project when he was only 32 years old. Now we see him sitting down because he could not walk very well because he got something called Caisson's disease. So the first thing that they had to build with the Brooklyn Bridge were the two towers. So they first started with the Brooklyn Tower and then the Manhattan Tower. And the way that you build these towers in the water, remember, it's hard to build things underwater. So they did it with something called a caisson. Can you guys say caisson? Okay, essentially, these are just giant wooden boxes, okay, and they're turned upside down. So they're open on the bottom and they're closed on the top, right? And so it took about a week to sink it just half a foot. And they had to sink it 44 feet to get to the bottom of the Brooklyn side of the East River. So the way that they would sink it is they would put stone and brick on top of that caisson. And slowly, week by week, and after putting 70,000 tons of stone and brick on top of these caissons, they were able to sink them all the way down to the mud of the East River. Now, remember earlier we were talking about workers. I mentioned some people called sand hogs. These were the nicknames of the people that worked down in these caissons. They were digging down in the sand. They were trying to get down to the bedrock. So it's, you build structures on rock, not sand, to make them more sturdy and stable. And this was dangerous work. So people were getting something called Caisson's disease. Today we know it as the bends. So if you have any scuba divers in your family, or you've ever been scuba diving yourself, then you may have heard of the bends before. That's what we call it today. But back then, during the Brooklyn Bridge, they called it the Caisson's disease. And what that is, basically, water is a lot heavier than air, right? So because of that, it's a lot more pressure on our bodies. So all this air that they pump into the caisson, it's filled with air. They pumped all the water out. And all this air down here is compressed. It's compressed air. And that's what's interesting about this is one of the gases in air, nitrogen, and it's in water. When it enters our skin, when it gets really small bubbles, and it can get big if we go up too fast. So those little nitrogen air bubbles inside of us, if we go up to the surface too quickly, they'll stay in our body and they'll give us what's called the bends. And that's what paralyzed, for the most part, partially paralyzed Washington Roebling. Okay. And so this is an illustration of the caisson that was built on the Brooklyn side. And so once they got this thing on bedrock, they were able to build up. Now, interestingly enough, the Manhattan side, they never reached bedrock because The bedrock is over 100 feet down. They only made it to about 78 feet. So many people were getting sick that they decided to just stop the project. So that means even today, the Manhattan Tower is not sitting on rock. It's just on sand. The next job was to string the 4 main cables. The way the main cables were constructed were 19 strands made up a main cable. This main cable is 15.5 inches wide, roughly, and or 15 3/4 to be precise. And each one of these 19 strands has little individual wires in them that are about the size of or width of a pencil. We call this 8-gauge wire. So I want to know from all of you, this little 8-gauge wire, many of those makes up a strand, and then 19 of these strands makes up a main cable. And then we have 4 main cables. So how many wires, those little 8-gauge wires, do you think is in all 4 of those main cables going from Manhattan to Brooklyn to Manhattan in the Brooklyn Bridge? And that's our last survey question of the day before we launch our quiz. So how many wires are in the 4 main cables? What do you guys think? Is it red 10,000, blue over 20,000, green under 1,000, or 5,000 yellow? All right, it is over 20,000 cables 20,000 wires are used to construct those 4 main cables. So what does that look like, guys? All of these little cables, so we have 19 strands in the main cable, and then each of these 19 strands are made up of 278 wires. So if you do your math, 278 times 19 times 4, you're going to get over 20,000 wires going back and forth. So once they had the towers built on the Brooklyn Bridge, they had to string up these main cables. They run all of these over 20,000 wires across the river. And once they are all strung across, someone's job was to walk along and string those together, first putting them in the strands and then wrapping all of them into 4 main cables. Once that is done, they anchor those into the anchorages on each side of the river. Remember, we learned about the anchorages, and inside of those anchorages are large anchor plates that have eye bolts on them so that all of the wires are connected to them, and they are very large themselves. They weigh 23 tons apiece, okay? And then the last thing you do when you're constructing a suspension bridge is you actually suspend the deck. Now, I could not find any photos of the Brooklyn Bridge. This is the Manhattan Bridge, but it would have been done the same way. So you start, you hang all of the suspension cables, and then you start putting in each section of the deck from both the Manhattan and Brooklyn side until you meet in the middle. All right, and that's how the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed. We're going to go ahead and jump right into our Geo quiz for any classrooms that need to go ahead and head out for their day in their schedule. I'll be on a bit longer to answer as many questions as I can in a lightning round afterwards. So let's go ahead and launch that survey to see how well you guys, that quiz, to see how well you guys were paying attention. Remember, today's winner will get a postcard from me, GOB, from the Learn Around the World Studios. Okay, let's go ahead and do it, guys. How many boroughs are in New York City? How many boroughs in New York City? Is it red 3, blue 4, yellow 5, or green 2? 5 boroughs. Great job. All right, Epic Unicorn is out to the lead. The Brooklyn Bridge is a suspension bridge. Is that true or false? All right, red, false, blue, true. All right, blue, true. All right, Mystery Moose takes the lead. All right, who designed the Brooklyn Bridge? Who was it that drew up the plans? Was it red, John Roebling, blue, George Washington, green, Frederick Law Umstead, or Washington Roebling, yellow? Right, it was John Roebling. Okay, Epic Unicorn still in the lead. Wise Dog napping on their hooves. All right, the Brooklyn Bridge connects Brooklyn and red, the Bronx, blue, Queens, yellow, Staten Island, or green, Manhattan. All right, it is Manhattan. Great job, Epic Unicorn, still in the lead, not by much. What river does the Brooklyn Bridge cross? Is it red, Mississippi River, blue, the East River, green, the Hudson River, or yellow, the New York River? Right, it was the East River. And today's winner is dun 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 dun, Epic Unicorn. Great job, Epic Unicorn. If you're Epic Unicorn's teacher, please send me your school address. You can do that in one place only, and that's over at learnaroundtheworld.com/prize. That URL is at the bottom of your screen. Just go to our website /prize. Do not email it to me. Do not put it in the chat box. Put it in the Google form there. That's the only way they get sent out. Okay, so we're going to open up the, if you have to run, have a great day. Thank you for coming along and virtually walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. If you have time to stick around for a few more minutes and ask more questions, go ahead and get those sent in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, first coming up, looks like we have someone in Mrs. Escobar's classroom. Go for it.
Where did they get all the stone to lay on the caissons?
On the caissons, you know what? I did not research where they got their stone from as far as the quarry. I knew I read about it at one point. I'll put it to Flipgrid. I don't have it in my quick notes that I have here. But let's see. Let's go over to Mrs. Guerrero's classroom. All right, I think I can hear you guys now.
Just wave bye. Say bye.
All right. Just got them in the nick of time to say goodbye. All right, guys, have a great day. And we're going to go ahead and check over on Twitter. Mrs. McDermott's fourth graders wanted to know, why was the bridge so long past the water over the lands? Okay, and when did I go to the Brooklyn Bridge? And how do you build a bridge over water? Okay, great questions coming in. So first off of that was, let's see, why is it so long? Okay, it's like a ramp. It's like an on ramp, right? So remember, it's going 135 feet up in the air. So you have to get up that 135 feet, right? So you don't, if you're driving a car, you don't drive straight up and over, right? So it's like if you are driving up to an on-ramp onto a highway, you have to have a long, gradual incline. And not only cars, but they were doing a subway goes over it. So you need a gradual increase. So that's why it's so long going over. Or one of the reasons. I've been to the Brooklyn Bridge many a times. The last time that I went to the Brooklyn Bridge was just this past, maybe this past December, if not definitely this past August, I was there. But I'm in New York a lot. So great questions coming from there. Let's see. That's all the ones I see over there. Or how do you build over the water, they wanted to know. And partly is because they kind of work their way inward. So once they string up all the main cables, the decks you slowly build from the edges to the middle. That's how you get out there. All right, let's go over to Mrs. Escobar's class. You got time to ask more questions?
We were just going to log out, but we wanted to say thank you. We really enjoyed the show.
All right. Well, have a great day, guys. Have a good weekend. All right. And for everyone else out there, looks like that's all the questions that I see coming in. Have a fantastic weekend and enjoy your day. Until next time, I'm GOB. You've been watching the Geo Show, so keep exploring, guys. Bye.